Hi guys, how are you doing? Welcome back. Let's talk about a self-hosted password manager and let's talk about Vaultwarden. This is a self-hosted password manager I have been using for years now. I also set it up for my family to use it and we are completely satisfied with it. That means all the data which I'm storing in that Vaultwarden Docker container, because I'm running it in a Docker container, all the data is kept secure and private on my own network, on my own server. This is a Docker container, a Docker host, which it doesn't have access to the internet, and you cannot access it from the internet. You can only access it when you are connected in my home, in my local network. From a security perspective, you want your password manager not to be connected to the internet because a lot of password managers today are a cloud service, and I have subscription fatigue, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have that as well. So I don't want to pay an extra subscription for something I need to be trusting completely and blindly, because the chances are that I will have all my bank account information in my password manager as well. Now, if I'm storing it in a cloud solution, in a cloud password manager, and we've all seen the news for the last few years, there have been breaches in cloud-based password managers. I don't want my private personal account data to be leaked to the internet. And this is exactly where Vaultwarden comes in. It is a password manager, and the server component, that's the Vaultwarden Docker container I'm running on my Docker host. I will show you in a minute how to set it up. And how do you get access to all those stored passwords in that Vaultwarden Docker container, in the Vaultwarden server, so to speak? Well, we are using an app for that on your desktop PC or your macOS or your iPhone or on Android or your Linux computer. You can use the official Bitwarden app for that. The official Bitwarden app is a free app because it connects to a Bitwarden server, and a Bitwarden server is a paid solution. You can self-host that and then pay a subscription, or you can get it from the cloud service for Bitwarden. Now, the Bitwarden app is free, and the Vaultwarden Docker container, which basically replicates a Bitwarden server, is a open source solution, and I am using that Vaultwarden Docker container as an open source solution. It mimics my Bitwarden server, so to speak, so I can connect all my Bitwarden front-end apps on all my clients to that Vaultwarden container. Now, Vaultwarden does not have any affiliates with Bitwarden, of course. Vaultwarden is a solution, open source, and fully on its own. The nice thing is that you can use the official Bitwarden front-end apps to connect to it. Let's get into it. All right, so here we are on my Docker server. This is a Docker, a virtual machine running in my network, but this virtual machine does not have access to the internet. It's only accessible if you have access in my local area network, in my LAN. So basically, if you're connected at home to my LAN, you can have access to this server. Now, this server is running that Vaultwarden Docker container. And in this Vaultwarden Docker container, this is the place where I'm storing all the data. And the way to access that data which you're storing in Vaultwarden is, of course, that Bitwarden app. I will show you in a minute how that works. So having Vaultwarden run in your own network, I have been running this for several years now, and actually a few family members are also using this solution. That's very nice because this is to make sure, 100% make sure that data which you're storing in your password manager, it can be very sensitive, very private data, like account information, patient information, hospital information. All that data is only accessible from your own network and is being stored on your own server. That means it cannot be leaked, right? If you, of course, make sure that it is secure, it cannot be leaked via a breach or a hack from the internet, because it is not connected to the internet. We have seen the last few years that several password managers which are offering cloud services, which are a cloud offering, they have been breached or the data have been accessible from the internet. And that's not very comforting for the people who were actually using those services. So that's not something we want. We want to store it in our own home, on our own premise, and make sure that it's only accessible from the local area network. So you will need this Docker host, a Docker host, which can run Vaultwarden. And what we're looking at is actually Portainer. And I am using Portainer to manage my Docker hosts, to deploy containers there and deploy stacks using Docker Compose. But before we do that, let's look at the Docker Hub page for Vaultwarden itself. As you can see here, it's an alternative implementation of the Bitwarden Server API written in Rust, and it is compatible with upstream Bitwarden clients. So that means our Vaultwarden project, our Vaultwarden server, it's open source. It's compatible with all the Bitwarden clients, like I said, so you can use the official Bitwarden clients to access your Vaultwarden server. And you will not need to have a subscription to access it because you're self-hosting it. Vaultwarden is free and the Bitwarden clients are free as well. So it's perfect for a self-hosted deployment. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're self-hosting it. It's in our network. It's disconnected from the internet. We are not going to pay anyone for nothing. There are no subscription fees. We are completely in charge of what is happening with this password manager, this Vaultwarden server, and where the data is stored. So if you look at the Vaultwarden server, they have a very extensive wiki page which you can access and see how to set it up and what are the different parameters, configuration options in there, because you can set the Docker container up with several environment options. Well, one of them is disable registration of new users. Maybe something you want to do if you're running it in your own network. This option specifically, I am highlighting this because this is something we will have to have enabled the first time we are setting up Vaultwarden, because you need to create a new user. If you decide afterwards that you don't want user signups, then you can go into the Docker Compose file or in the environment option using Portainer and then disable the signups allowed option. So in my case, let's go back to my Portainer and see how I did it. So if I click on stacks, I have set up a stack for Vaultwarden. Let's open it up, go to the editor. And as you can see here, like I showed you, I am allowing signups. I've set it to true because I need to create a initial user account. That's the first account I need to create. And if I say signups allowed is false, this will not happen. And basically I have a useless Vaultwarden server. We don't want that. The second thing is to think about where you want to store the data. Do you want to store it in a Docker volume or a specific path on your Docker host? That's for you to decide. And of course, using which port number we are actually going to use to access this Vaultwarden server. On the external Docker container side, it's using 11001, and internally in the container, within the container, it will be using port 80. Now, once you've set up this Docker Compose file, you can just click on update or deploy the stack. In my case, I only have the update option because I've already deployed it. So if you deploy it and you go back to containers, you will see that your Vaultwarden server is up and running. Now, if I click on Vaultwarden, I can do all the operations I would do on a Docker when I have access to the Docker CLI from my Docker host, but now I can do it from Portainer. And Portainer actually is giving you a very nice overview of all the settings and options you have for this container. You can redeploy it, you can change parameters, you can change paths or volumes. You can even add new environment options here, because if we go back to our Vaultwarden wiki, we can see that there are several options you can configure in that Docker container, like an admin token. An admin token is something you need to configure, and it will give you access to a admin panel in Vaultwarden, and it will allow you to configure things like SMTP server, etc., etc. I'm not going into those details, but this is an option you would basically set up to have admin access to that Vaultwarden container. And just like this, there are several options in there you can configure. it's already perfectly fine, documented perfectly fine on the wiki of Vaultwarden. Now let's go back to Portainer and let's see the container. It's running, and I will access that container from my web browser. So if I open a new tab and access that, open up that web browser, I have already some things running, and we need port 11001. Now this is the Vaultwarden server. This is actually running in that Docker container, my Vaultwarden server. But as you can see here, it is not secure. I need to change this, because if I don't do that, I will not be able to create that first user and any other user after that. But I will also not be able to access my Vaultwarden server using the Bitwarden clients or even a web browser, because I have to have, the requirement is to have a Let's Encrypt certificate. Well, I'm using that Let's Encrypt certificate from my Nginx Proxy Manager. I've set that up here as well on the Docker host. So if I go back to stacks, and this is my Portainer interface on my Docker host, of course, you can see that I have added a additional stack to run Nginx Proxy Manager. I click on Edit, and this is the code I am using for my Nginx Docker container. I'm not doing anything fancy with SQL or something like that. It's just a straightforward setup. The only thing I adjusted here are actually the paths where I'm saving my data, my configuration data for Nginx Proxy Manager, and also my certificates for Let's Encrypt. So let's see my Nginx server. It's running with an admin interface of port 81. And of course, it is a reverse proxy, so it should be listening on port 80 and port 443. So in order to access that admin interface, we need to connect to the admin interface. Let me log out here real quick. So as you can see here, this is my Docker host, that IP address there, and the port number is 81. So this is the port number for my Nginx admin. Let's click on my user there, and let's enter the password real quick. So the first step is to get a SSL certificate from Let's Encrypt. And when you've done that, you need to enter that domain, of course. So in my case, I'm using vaultwarden.nginx.nl. And I'm using the Let's Encrypt Cloudflare option, because using a Cloudflare token, I can then provision or get a certificate from Let's Encrypt. I don't have to do any DNS stuff within my public record for vcache.nl. This is a very nice setup. The requirement for this is that your domain should be running on Cloudflare. So I've acquired an SSL certificate, and now the next thing is I have to make sure that vaultwarden.vcache.nl is actually redirecting or going to my Nginx Proxy Manager, because I'm using Nginx as a reverse proxy. So if I do vaultwarden.vcache.nl, we can see that it is my Nginx Proxy Manager, which is running on top of my Docker host. That's the IP address of my Docker host. The way I've set this up is I have a central DNS server in my network, and I've set up split DNS. So basically what I'm telling my DNS server internally is, when someone wants to resolve vaultwarden.vcache.nl, send it to, or give it the entry that it is resolved to this internal IP. Of course, this record does not exist on the internet and is not resolvable for the internet. And in this way, I can make sure that this is only staying using that split DNS option in my central DNS server. This is only staying in my network. Now, when I've made sure that vaultwarden.vcache.nl is being directed to my Nginx Proxy Manager, I need to set up a host in Nginx Proxy Manager. So let's go back to Nginx Proxy Manager, click on Proxy Host, and as you can see here, I've already set up a host which will process my requests for vaultwarden.vcache.nl. and it will forward it when it gets a request for the domain name vaultwarden.nginx.nl. It will forward it to the IP address and the port number of my Vaultwarden server. This is the IP address of the Docker host where Vaultwarden is running. Again, in this case, it's the same server as where Nginx is running. And this is the port where Vaultwarden server is listening on. Let's go real quick back here. As you can see here, this is the, so to speak, the naked URL, the naked access to Vaultwarden without reverse proxy, without SSL certificate. This is connecting directly to that Docker container. Now, that's the way we have to set up that proxy host in Nginx Proxy Manager. I've set a scheme for HTTP because when I'm using Nginx Proxy Manager, it will do the redirection from HTTP to HTTPS, and that's what we want. I've also enabled some other options here. Of course, these ones can be set, can be disabled. I would enable the WebSocket support. Go to SSL and then select that SSL certificate, which I already acquired from Let's Encrypt. I set this the Force SSL to enable and also HTTP to support. Now I've set up everything from a reverse proxy perspective point of view to have a valid step up to access my Vaultwarden server. So now that we know that my Nginx Proxy Manager is listening, let's go to Vaultwarden itself. So when I connect to vaultwarden.vcache.nl using HTTPS, I'm being presented with my Vaultwarden server using HTTPS and using a secure connection. As you can see here, my connection is now secure, so we are in business. So the first thing to do is create an account because we don't have an account yet. Let's create one. I will set up YouTube demo at vcache.nl. That's me. Master password is my master password. Remember, this is a very important step and it will only work if you've set up that specific environment option to sign up allowed. That's the first thing you need to do. So this is my default master password. And I disable this option because this server will not have access to the internet. Let's create an account. I don't want to save it. And as you can see here, my account has been created. So now I'm able to log in to my Vaultwarden server using the account I've just created. And the way we're going to do that is enter the username. That's the email address I used to create my account just now. Let's say I want to remember that email. Click on continue. It will ask me for my master password. Let's enter that. And now I can log into my Vaultwarden server. You have several tools, of course. You have a password generator as well, which you can use. Well, it is a full-featured, full-blown password manager, self-hosted with every option there is in a password manager, which you would expect. Actually, even passkeys, etc., can be stored in here. Also, two-factor authentication with OTP. That's everything is working perfectly fine. Let's create a new item here. And I will create a login. As you can see here, you have several options. You can even create a secure node and then share it using that send option here. For that send option to work, you need to create or configure a SMTP server in that admin URL. That's something for another video. For now, I'm just going to create a account or I want to store account information here for my YouTube demo. The folder is, there are no folders. I can create folders here as well. The username is YouTube demo at vcache.nl. And then we have a password. You can, of course, let it generate a password for you. And that means if it generates a password, you can now use this password to set up that account for that specific service or website. But what I'm going to do is I will disable that, and I already have set up the password for my account, YouTube demo. I'm not going to do a TOTP, that's fine. I can add a URL. Well, actually, let's do something else. Let's say this is my Nginx admin interface. And what I can do is go back to my Nginx admin interface, and then I can add that URL. Oh, let's go real quick. This is not the one I'm looking for. The one I'm looking for is here, of course, in this SSL one. Let's paste the URL and let's say we want to save it. Now, as you can see here, I have added my first item here. This is the way to store all your passwords. You don't need to remember passwords for every service you're using. Just remember one password, that master password, to access your Vaultwarden password manager, and in there you will have stored every account you have. And now we have Vaultwarden up and running via the website. It's time to connect the Bitwarden client. This is a Windows Bitwarden client. I'm on a Windows PC here. And this is the Bitwarden client for Windows, yes. And we will need to connect it to our Vaultwarden password manager. And the reason, one of the important reasons to do this is that a Bitwarden client, every time it connects to our Vaultwarden password manager, it will copy a local read-only cache for all the accounts in your Vaultwarden password manager. And that's very handy to have, because if you're outside your home, you don't have access to your Vaultwarden server, your Bitwarden client on your device will still have that local cache, that read-only cache of all the accounts living in your Vaultwarden password manager. The only thing you need to do is, of course, connect it when you're at home, connect it to that Vaultwarden server so it can sync up all changes, all new accounts from that Vaultwarden server. So we are going to enter my email address here in this Windows client. And as you can see here, it says logging in on. I'm not going to do the bitwarden.com because that's the paid cloud service or the paid self-hosted service. I'm going to do just self-hosted and then enter the URL for my Vaultwarden server. Let's do this real quick like this. All right. It has saved that. I will continue and I will enter my master password. Log in. And now we are connected with the Windows Bitwarden client to our Vaultwarden server. You can see it has already synced that account I have in that Vaultwarden password manager. So because there is a live connection, I'm from the client to my server, I am able to edit accounts. When there is no live connection, you cannot edit accounts on the clients. So your Windows client, your Bitwarden client on your mobile device, if you want to edit account information which is stored in your Vaultwarden client, it has to have a live connection. If it's not there, you are not able to add something new. So because I have a live connection, I'm able to edit this. And let's face it, every time you're at home, you will have a live connection from your device to your Vaultwarden server, right? Because it's only living in your own network. So click on edit. Let's add something as a note. Testing from YouTube. Perfectly fine. And I will save it. Item is saved. If I go back now to my Vaultwarden password manager and open up that same account information, I will see that my node has been updated immediately. If I remove it from there, click on save here, go back to my Bitwarden client, you will see now that that entry is gone for the nodes. If I click on edit, you will see there are no nodes in there. This is the WebSocket option which is handling this, because there is a live connection. Every change I'm making here on my client is propagated directly to my Vaultwarden server or vice versa. So that's something very important to have. If you are setting up a client on your mobile device, make sure that you initiate that connection when you're at home, and it has the option to sync all the accounts back to that client. So when you're not at home, you still have access to all your accounts. I've also set up that Bitwarden extension for my browser. In my case, this is a Brave browser for testing purposes. As you can see here, I have the extension installed. So when I click this, it will, of course, ask me for a username and a password. But as you can see here, we have the same option here to say we want to log into a self-hosted environment. What is that self-hosted environment then? Well, it's my vaultwarden.nginx.nl. I will save it. And I will say, remember my email address. Let's click on continue. And my master password, let's give that. Enter it here. And now I have this extension running in my browser connected back to my own Vaultwarden password manager. If I change something here, because that's also possible, it will sync back, of course, to my central Vaultwarden server, as long as there is a live connection. Otherwise, it will only have a local read-only cache of the passwords of the information which it has synced up from the Vaultwarden server the last time it had a successful connection. It's very convenient to have, because when we go back to my Nginx Proxy Manager, if I would log out here, sign out, you can see here that that Bitwarden extension is telling me that, hey, because I've entered a URL in my Nginx account, which I have stored in my Vaultwarden server, it recognizes that URL and tells me that I have a valid account for that. And now I can just click on the extension, click here on that account which is popping up, because it is recognizing this URL, and it will fill out the information automatically for me. Click on sign in, and I'm back logged in to my Nginx Proxy Manager. And this is exactly the same way it works for the clients on your mobile devices or on your Linux computer or on your Mac OS device. In this way, I can make sure that my data is only stored on my own network. You can get access to it when you're at my home and in my network. Then you can only get access to it. And even then, of course, you need to authenticate before you can actually see what's in there. I don't have to pay anyone, no cloud service with a subscription fee, and hoping that they are keeping my data safe, because let's face it, in the last few years, there have been several breaches of passwords managers online. I don't want to get in that situation, which will keep me up at night. In this way, I'm making sure I'm in control of where that data lives and who has access to it. Let me know in the comments if you have other options you consider, other password managers which is giving you the same flexibility and the same privacy and security levels I have here. I'm curious to know how you guys are setting it up. And at the same time, thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to click on the like and subscribe buttons below. It will help out my channel a lot. And of course, leave your comments in the comment field. I will get to them as soon as possible. Take care and see you in the next video. Bye.